And Wendy Curtis at Your Move Frank Farr. Just looking for a brief intro or general information on the fee ban. How would you answer that in a couple of minutes for them?
So I think the key thing to think about with the tenant fees ban is all charges, absolutely everything, is banned to tenants from the 1st of June for new tenancies unless they are specifically made permitted payments. So work on the principle that absolutely every penny a tenant pays is unlawful unless it is actively allowed by the legislation. So the things that are actively allowed, number one, the rent. And I think that really goes to show it's everything unless it has been specifically made allowable. So the first one that is allowed is obviously the rent. I'm sure everybody will be pleased to know that. Utility bills, so gas, electricity, water, council tax, broadband, TV licenses, all of those, all utilities are also permitted payments. Then we have a holding deposit capped at 1 week's rent, a security deposit capped at 5 weeks rent, or if the annual aggregate rent on the property is over £50,000, then it's capped at 6 weeks rent. You then have tenant default fees. There are now only 2 tenant default fees. One is rent arrears, and the second one is lost keys or other security devices. You can also charge for a variation, novation, or assignment of contract. That is effectively a change of sharer or a change in the contract that is requested by the tenant during the tenancy, not at the beginning, only during. And surrender of tenancy, if the tenant wishes to surrender their tenancy early. And the final one is Green Deal payments or other energy efficiency charges.
Okay, very helpful, thank you. And just, you mentioned there that it's for ASTs and of under £50,000 rent. A question from Samantha Hubbard at Beresford. Does this also include non-Housing Act tenancies as well?
So no, the ban is actually quite narrow in what types of tenancies that are banned. So William, as you said, yes, it's assured short hold tenancies, ASTs, and licenses to occupy only. So any non-Housing Act tenancies, so Rent Act tenancies, Rent Agriculture Act tenancies, secure tenancies, they're all outside the scope of the ban, as are corporate lets. So if you're doing company lets, you're issuing a non-Housing Act tenancy to the company, so they're outside of the scope of the ban. You can continue charging fees on your company lets. The other one to think about as well is assured tenancies. So assured tenancy, the AST is a derivation of the assured tenancy. And I know most agents don't, but if you do let on assured tenancies, you can continue charging fees on those. Final point on ASTs, particularly for our central London colleagues, do remember that the threshold of an AST is an annual aggregate rent of £100,000. If the rent on the property is over £100,000, it is a non-Housing Act tenancy, and therefore you can continue to charge fees on those very high rent properties.
Okay, great. And just before we move on to the next section, David, do you want to just confirm how final this is? There's a question from James Bolton at Wilson's, who said, why didn't the government just cap fees at a fair limit, like £250? Is there any chance that that might still happen?
With the best will in the world, there was no chance that was ever going to happen, I'm afraid. It was something we argued for, and we in fact argued for a policy of splitting and spreading the fees over the first 6 months of the tenancy. But this was a policy that had cross-party support. Normally, when I'm engaging with Parliament and Westminster, you can usually play one side off against the other. But with an issue like this, and actually it's very similar with the issue with Section 21 as well, it was proposed by the Conservative Party, as is the ban of Section 21. Both tenant fees and Section 21 and the ban on Section 21 is supported by the Labour Party. The SNP in Scotland has already banned their version of Section 21 and banned tenant fees, and the Lib Dems are supportive. So it wasn't like I could play one side of the house off against the other on this issue and on the abolition of Section 21. All sides of the house are in agreement, at which point what we have been trying to do is mitigate the impact for agents. We were never going to be able to overturn it. It was just had too much support. I think to a certain extent, I've said it from the stage at ARLA conference in 2015, 16 and 17, that this was an inevitability. It was not something we were ever going to be able to overcome. But what we have tried to do over the last 3 years is mitigate the impact and explain to politicians and the government and the civil servant the impact of what this is going to do. And they have made quite a few concessions in what is now permitted payments.
Great. Okay, good. Thank you very much, David. I think I want to turn to the next set of questions here, Richard, which is really a bunch of questions around what's in and what's out. For example, I've got a question from David Rogers at Martin & Co, who asks, what are we supposed to do when a tenant locks themselves out and can't get in and insists we attend to let them in?
So a few things you can do on that one. That actually comes down to the default fees, which is lost keys and other security devices. So if a tenant has locked themselves out at 2 o'clock in the morning, for example, it was actually an argument that we made very strongly that is an agent going to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, go to let a tenant in if they've locked themselves out, and not charge for it. So what the government has said is you'll be able to cover the cost of replacement keys. You'll be able to, although it's not explicit in the guidance, it's certainly our understanding that you will be able to charge if a locksmith is needed, if a lock needs to be changed, because it talks about keys and other security devices. Well, key is one part, the lock is the other security device. So I think you will be fine with that. And it says in exceptional circumstances, you will be able to charge £15 per hour for your time in this. Now, I would argue that 1.5, yes. I would argue that those sort of exceptional circumstances are coming out of hours. But you will be able to prove, you will need to be able to prove that it has cost you that sort of money. You will also need to prove it is an exceptional circumstance. So what I would recommend, or what I would not recommend, is adding that £15 an hour to every time you get called, but only in very exceptional circumstances where the tenant has done something that has put them in a difficult, vulnerable situation, such as being locked out at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, okay, very good, thank you. What about questions from Claire Woodrow at Ashington Page and Kingsley, Sarah at Kings and Marsh, professional cleaning or inventories?
So inventories are definitely out. So if I just quickly run through sort of the main ones that are out. So no more admin fees, application fees, setup fees, contract negotiation fees, referencing fees, check-ins, check-outs, inventories, renewal fees, end of tenancy fees, surrender of Saturday move-in fees. Those are all out. Things like professional cleaning, technically that's actually been illegal since 1977 under the Unfair Contract Terms Act. So for a long time, you haven't been able to say the property must be professionally cleaned. I know it's been in a lot of tenancy agreements since that time, but I think the tenant fees ban is actually starting to highlight some of these industry norms that aren't actually lawful. So you can't say the property must be professionally cleaned at the end of the tenancy. All you can say is the property must be returned in the state that it was at the beginning of the tenancy. Yeah. If that is professionally cleaned, you can say which was professionally cleaned and be able to evidence it with a receipt. And therefore you can then expect the property back at a professionally clean standard. But you can't mandate that they use a professional cleaner because, for example, you might have a tenant who is a professional cleaner and can get the property up to a professional clean standard without needing to employ a third party to do it. Having said that, if you say it needs to be returned in the condition that it was, and it was professionally cleaned, here's the evidence to show it. If it's not, you can then at the end go and get it professionally cleaned and deduct the cost of that professional clean from the deposit. What you can't do, and what will be classed as a prohibited payment, is mandate that it is professionally cleaned by a third-party company.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, very clear. What about, Josh Mitchell asks from Sugar House Properties, fees permissible for late payment of rent? Can you clarify how that works?
So I'll start with what you can't charge and then I'll move on to what you can. So for example, you can't charge for, I'm trying to think, £25 for sending a letter for late payment, charging tenants for phoning to chase late rent payments. All you can charge is interest on rent arrears. And that interest charge is calculated at 3% above the Bank of England's base rate from the date the rent falls due until the date it is paid. However, you can't levy that charge unless the tenant is at least 14 days in arrears. So if they're 10 days late paying the rent, you can't levy the interest charge. If they're 15 days late paying the rent, you can levy the interest charge, and you can backdate it to when it fell due, which I hope everybody understands that one.
So they can't pay 13 days interest, but they can pay 14 or 15 days interest.
Exactly, absolutely. Now, what I would say is, these interest payments are pennies. So I think I did a calculation yesterday actually, and I think it works out at if a tenant is late with £500 arrears, you would only generate just over £18.70. I think it's exactly £18.74 in 12 months. So if they're a month late, you're talking maybe £1.50, something like that. So these interest payments, with the best will in the world, it's probably going to end up costing agents more to levy the charge than they will actually get in the interest payment. Having said that, make sure that is in your tenancy agreement so that you can levy the charge if they're massively late and it's actually worth levying it. But you're not going to get a great deal in terms of interest payment. What I would also say is make sure you check your tenancy agreement. Most tenancy agreements talk about 4% or 8% above the Bank of England's base rate. ARLA's previous tenancy talked about 4% above Barclays' base rate. So make sure you are looking at your tenancy agreement and you change that interest clause.
Yeah, okay, very good tip there, thank you. Question from Twitter from Amanda Mitchell. She asks, can you still charge a tenant for negligence, e.g. if they block a toilet?
Yes, that is actually a very good question, Amanda. So that is within what is known as the damages provisions within the Act. So what the Act says and what the guidance says is that you can charge the tenant for returning the property to the condition it would have been in had the tenant not breached the tenancy agreement. So I'm going to use stuffing nappies down a toilet as an example. Should a tenant stuff nappies down the toilet? Firstly, you have to factor in that the landlord has to ensure the property is fit for human habitation under the New Homes Act that came into force a few weeks ago, but also Section 11 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985. So if tenant blocks toilet with nappies, firstly, the landlord does have to return it and fix the problem. So it does need to be fixed, otherwise you're in breach of other laws. But what you can do then is bill the tenant immediately. So effectively bill the tenant for the contractor call out to come and fix it. If the tenant refuses, you can either take them to court there and then through the small claims court, or you can take them to court after the tenancy is ended, or, which is probably the most likely, you can deduct it from their deposit at the end of the tenancy. Now, what I would say is you can only deduct it from the deposit at the end of the tenancy, provided that the tenancy agreement allows you to do so. So you have a clause in it that says the tenant will indemnify the landlord against damage caused by themselves during the tenancy. Slightly better and more legal version of that, but also, and this is the most important one, you must make sure that the deposit clause in your tenancy agreement allows deductions for damages. So make sure that you've got the tenant will indemnify the landlord for the various breaches, blocking toilets, etc., but also that the deposit clause allows you to deduct those damages from the deposit. That's particularly important because if the deposit clause doesn't allow it and it goes to a dispute, the schemes won't award the money for that. So make sure you've got it effectively twice. For those Property Mark members, we've already updated our AST. What I would recommend you use it, but if you don't want to use it, at least download it. It is free for members and it's got those clauses in there.
Great. Okay, super. Thank you. A couple of other questions again around this what's in, what's out question. One from Simon Gressel at Finlay Brewer. If he's got customers who want help finding somewhere to move to or find somewhere to live, can he charge them a property finding fee?
So I think I think what he's talking about is a kind of the relocation agent
Yeah.
situation, so where they're finding a property for a tenant.
Yeah.
That is acceptable, and you can charge a tenant a fee for finding them a property, with one caveat: you can't show them any of your properties. So you can charge the tenant for finding them a property with a different landlord or agent. But if you are the agent of the property that the tenant chooses, you can't charge them a finder's fee. So effectively, yes, but don't show them any of your own properties, otherwise you'll be in breach of the law.
Okay, and actually related, but arguably even more cunning, question from Simon Seabag, Phil Spector. Can tenants volunteer to pay application fees to obtain priority status for a property after the 1st of June?
No.
Okay.
Just no.
No, fine. Okay. Okay, great. And regarding early termination, David, a question from Charlotte Dyer at Regal Estates around the surrender of tenancy. Can we charge the fees the LLD would have for reletting if a tenant wants to break the tenancy early? This wasn't clear on our last webinar. She's just asking for clarification.
Sorry, William, would you mind asking that question again, please?
Sorry, yeah. So this is a question regarding surrender of tenancy. Can we charge the fees the LLD would have for reletting if a tenant wants to break their tenancy early? This was unknown still last webinar.
Yeah, I understand now. Sorry. So, yes, I understand why this one's come back up, because at the last webinar we hadn't had the guidance come out, so I wasn't quite sure what the answer was at that moment in time. We have now had the guidance come out, and what the guidance says is that, yes, you will be able to charge an early surrender fee. That fee cannot be more than the total rent outstanding on the property, but it should be reasonable. So what the government has suggested is that agents will be able to charge the landlord's costs in reletting the property, plus the rent until the new tenant moves in. And that's actually what we've put on our standard template, our fees template. So thinking about that in practice, the vast majority of agents have some form of landlord setup fee for setting up the tenancy. Yeah. So what I would suggest, and if you don't have one, I would suggest you put one in now, that whatever that fee is for the landlord, we will charge you £200, £300 to set up the tenancy. That is the charge that you put on to the tenant as the landlord's costs in reletting, for two reasons. One, it's nice, simple and transparent, because that fee will have to be on your landlord fee schedule. So all they need to do is look on the wall and there it is. But also it makes it very transparent, very clear. So you charge that fee plus all the rent until the new tenant moves in. And I think that will be classed as fair and reasonable. And what you put on your tenant fee schedule is early surrender, the landlord's costs in reletting, please see landlord fee schedule, plus all rent outstanding on the property until the tenant moves in, up to a maximum of the total rent outstanding on the property. And again, even if you don't use our fee templates, look at it, because we've got the set of wording on there.
Yeah, very helpful. And actually, talking of fee schedules, and just last one from this section, David, Michelle Law from Chamberlain's just said, where can we find the final definitive list of fees we can charge tenants and the caps?
Well, one, you can find it in the Act itself.
Right.
You can also find it in the guidance. If you are an ARLA member, you can find it in our fact sheets that you can download from the fact sheet section, or download the tenant fees toolkit. But I've outlined earlier what those are, and I can go through the caps on them if that would help quickly.
I think it would actually, yeah.
So obviously rent is rent. Don't need to worry, you can charge whatever you want in rent. Similarly, utilities are utilities. Holding deposits are capped at 1 week's rent. And to work out these weeks, by the way, it is month times 12 divided by 52. And that is what will get you the 1 week holding deposit. The security deposit, you then multiply the holding deposit by 5 or 6, to get the 5 or 6 week security deposit. Novation, variation, assignment of contract, the change of sharer, or the requests, that is capped at £50, including VAT, or your reasonable costs if higher. If you charge more than the £50, you have to be able to prove it. So really, the only situation that I can think where you'll be able to charge more than £50, because you can't charge for your time, is a change of sharer where you need to do an inventory. But what you won't be able to do is do £50 plus the cost of the inventory. What you will have to charge the referencing cost that you've been charged by your provider plus the inventory cost. If that comes to more than £50, you can charge it. If you can't, you can't charge it. What I would say, particularly for this one, is because you're not allowed to charge for your time, in a situation like this, I wouldn't recommend that the agency does an inventory. You get an external inventory clerk who then sends you a bill so that you can then prove to the tenant it has cost you more than £50. I hope that makes sense.
Yep. Very good. Okay. I think I might move on, though. Thank you very much for that. And yes, so there are more details available, starting with the Act, basically, is the key conclusion there. But we've got a lot of questions in general. Sorry, David, go on.
I was just going to say, just before we move on, there's a couple of ones when in the what's in, what's out that I would just highlight to agents. So the two really important ones are contents insurance and tenant liability insurance. Now, if you mandate those as a condition of granting the tenancy, i.e. you have to have contents insurance in order to get the tenancy, or you have to have tenant liability insurance, those will become prohibited payments unless the landlord picks up the bill for it. If you say we would strongly recommend you have contents insurance, and here are the list of providers that we would recommend and we get a commission from them, that's absolutely fine. But if you mandate it, it becomes a prohibited payment. Okay. So do factor those ones in. Yeah, similarly, utility bills. A lot of properties or agents will say the rent is £500 a month and then 150 for bills. If you do that, although it's not tenant fees ban related, you have to be really careful about the maximum resale provisions set by Ofgem. And if you're making a profit off that £150, you are liable to being classed as a utility provider and have to be Ofgem regulated. So I wouldn't recommend you do that. If you are going to do it inclusive of bills, the rent is, using that example, the rent is £650 including bills, because the legislation says the rent is the rent. If you start adding and bolting things onto the rent, that's when it gets a little bit questionable. So utility bills is one example. Another example is gardening or cleaning. If you want the tenant to have cleaning every month or every week or every 2 weeks, you want gardening once a month, you can't bolt those on, because those bolt-ons then become prohibited payments. What you can say is, say it costs £100 a month to do the cleaning. The rent is £600 a month, inclusive of cleaning. And then just don't specify what element is cleaning. It's just the rent as a whole includes cleaning, it includes utility bills, it includes that. And you build it all in one sum rather than multiple sums.
Very good, very clear, thank you.